Hey everybody, it's me, Chidini. You know, people are so fascinated with ownership. The idea of ownership, the notion of ownership, the belief in ownership. They don't see the cleverly deceptive difference between ownership and control. Those in powerful positions within our society today. They understand that thin strip of difference between ownership and control. As a matter of fact, they even use it as a deceptive means of empowerment for themselves, their causes, and their agendas. We have very powerful people in position in our society, such as George Bush, we can look up, who stood on the grounds of ownership society. And I have a quote, a direct quote from him right here. Let's get to it real quick. A quote that he made in December 16, 2003. This administration, meaning his administration, George W. Bush's administration, will constantly strive to promote an ownership society in America. We want more people owning their own homes. It is our national interest that more people own their own home. After all, if you own your own home, you have a vital stake in the future of our country. Okay? President George Bush, he set a goal to increase the number of minority homeowners by 5.5 million families by the end of the decade. Through his ownership challenge, it says here, through his ownership challenge, the president called on the private sector, that's private companies and organizations, to help in this effort. More than 24 companies and organizations have made commitments to increase minority home ownership, including pledges to provide more than $1.1 trillion in mortgage purchases for minority home buyers during the George W. Bush's administration. Now, this is something that can reach bipartisanship very easily. This is something I'm pretty sure Obama got under his wing, because this is something that, being a president, you want to have that type of achievement, you know. And with George W. Bush's administration, we can look back and we can see a lot of the negative things that occurred during his administration, of course. A lot of the negative things. But the U.S. home ownership rate reached 69.2% during George W. Bush's administration. That's close to 70% of home ownership in this land. But we had a war that negatively affected our economy. That's almost 70% of ownership in this country. Yet, we still have rising and increasing gas prices. Around 70% of ownership in this nation. Yet they still find a way to increase our taxes. Damn near 70% of ownership and Social Security becomes obsolete for the current and younger generations. Actually, the Social Security we pay now goes towards those who's already receiving Social Security and already benefiting from it. There's no more money in there. George Bush said it himself. There's no more money in Social Security for people my age, younger, maybe a little older, that's not already receiving it. There's no more money there. So we're living off the backs of our youngsters. But this goes, you know, home ownership or ownership period used to coincide with control. Control and ownership, was two of the same. You had the governor in the 1930s, you had the governor of Louisiana, the 40th governor of Louisiana, His name was Huey Long. He's also a U.S. Senator. And he stood on the grounds of share the wealth and every man a king. Now these words, you can see ownership and you can see control. When you say every man a king, that's every man having control of his own life, of his destiny. Share the wealth, having economic equality, having economic empowerment. And they assassinated him. Look it up. They assassinated him. They wasn't ready for him yet. But now you got George W. Bush, who tried to create an ownership society. But notice, every man a king did not come from his mouth. But ownership, trying to create ownership for everybody, you know. Kind of brings me back to the reason why Martin Luther King got assassinated. A lot of people think it's because he spoke out against the war, because he was with the sanitation strikers. That's not the case. He was with the Poor People's Campaign. He was about to get that off the ground, go to Washington, and he stated, and his exact quote was, "This time in Washington," and he was talking to the Poor People's Campaign, "This time in Washington, we're going to demand our check. We're coming to get our check," unquote. That was his quote. So it brings me back to that a little bit. They wasn't ready then. That was probably 30 years later from Huey Long. Okay. I got here a counseling service that counsels families and their wealth. It's called Cardia Family Wealth Counseling. It says the idea distinguishing between ownership and control is a new concept for many wealthy families. From a biblical standpoint and perspective, we should at least mentally acknowledge that we own nothing, right? We are mere caretakers of the Heavenly Father's property or nature's property. But the fact is, the name on the deed to our house, our stock certificates, and the titles of our vehicles still have our name on it. So even though from a spiritual perspective, we could say we only have relative ownership, but from a material perspective, most people still see ownership and control as essentially being two different sides of the same coin. In other words, I control what I own and I own what I control. The reality is that these two aspects of wealth not only can be divided, but the federal government has given us compelling reasons why they should be divided. Before we look at the major advantages of ownership and control, consider this intriguing and rather provocative question. If you had to choose between owning wealth but not having any control over it, or controlling wealth but not having any ownership of it, which would you prefer? It's an interesting idea, isn't it? When they asked their clients, they chose the latter, which was basically control. They'd rather have control over the wealth. What makes this issue so critically important is how the federal government chooses to tax wealth. Ownership carries with it maximum taxation. Ownership carries with it maximum taxation. This is today's times, people. Control without ownership carries with it no taxation. So if I can control the wealth but have no ownership, no direct title ownership to it, I don't get taxed. This is why George Bush stood for ownership society. It will make the government more money. It'll make the elite of society more money. Those in powerful positions more money. Because they'll tax you. And as we see, what goes with the tax money is not going to Social Security. It's not going to keep gas prices at a minimum. You know? Shoot, as of right now, Obama is going to take back a little bit from food stamps, from needy families. So it ain't going to that either. It's going to this war, which we have no control and no say. We could vote on these candidates, we could put money behind them, but we have no say because we have no economic power. Notice there ain't no Asian American or Indian American from India running for president. They have economic power. They have an economic power base in their country, in their motherland, and in this country. You got Chinatowns, you got these Indian families here, they stick together and what they be doctors, right? Most of them. I seen a Cleveland clinic that's owned by an Indian person. Yeah. So politicians are meant to be bought, so they can buy and persuade these and bribe these politicians. They don't need to be politicians. They have economic power, therefore they have political power. This is why back then they wasn't ready for Huey Long, the 40th governor of Louisiana. Back then they wasn't ready for Martin Luther King to fight against economic inequality. But now they're ready to give you some type of ownership so they can maximize their taxation on everybody.